following the salmon across the Atlantic. This week we're in Iceland, a land synonymous with countless stunning salmon rivers. My friend Peter Rippin is a pioneering Englishman who throughout his career has been setting up and running fishery operations throughout the world. Pete currently runs the East Ranga in Iceland, a very productive salmon river and unique in as much as it is solely a hatchery river run for angling. Due to its volcanic riverbed, it is too hostile for spawning. So the fishery is run entirely off a smolt release program, arguably resulting in a much more controllable salmon run. Based in Iceland for the past 20 years, Pete is perfectly placed to give his insights into the successes and failures of Iceland's salmon angling industry and where it might be heading in the context of declining salmon numbers. And is his stocking model one that can or should be replicated elsewhere?
If you think about quintessential rivers in Iceland, you definitely think of switch rods and downwards, hitching flies on the surface. I mean, the addiction for me started, I grew up as a kid fishing very small, very clear rivers for very few, very small grills. But, thrilling to see these fish come once, come twice, usually then calm down. But in Iceland, because these fish are brand new out the sea and the rivers they tend to be intact. So you're fishing, you work around the beats and you'll fish all of the river. You're covering fish that are super aggressive. And in fact, particular rivers have, for some reason, particularly aggressive fish. I think of likes of Midfjordara, which is super famous, Laxen also super famous, Laxen Dolum. They're all sort of west and northwest rivers, crystal clear, but the fish, you can hook an angry fish that absolutely savages your tiny little hitch and sort of have it on for 5-6 seconds, lose it, it'll go back to its rock or lie or channel and hook it again the next cast. It just becomes a playground that gives you a little bit more information visually and kind of thrill. That's for me anyway. I also love that calm, working your way down a long pool and casting a line and that sort of repetitive kind of meditation almost. But Iceland's, for me, the most special part of it is seeing what's going on. And they're very willing to come and hit a sunray, which I think they probably are in the UK as well when they're relatively fresh. Just there are more fish in a particular zone, usually in Iceland, in whatever river you're fishing, than there might be in one of our rivers.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. It's much more of a technical experience for an angler, or certainly I found it was, than perhaps the more traditional methods of big river fishing in Scotland. It's much more dynamic and active. I think those short season countries that have those short runs, like Norway, like Iceland, do tend to offer more aggressive fish. I think for whatever reason, a concentrated run tends to offer a more highly strung fish, shall we say. So 25 years you've known that country, which is a long time to have been lucky enough to have the keys to Iceland.
2 weeks before they officially announced the pandemic, that I left, having persuaded my mate to invest money in buying the East Ranga Lodge, and then obviously March 2020, and I was like, oh, I may have sold my mate down the river a little bit here, but we got very lucky. We got super lucky, and Iceland stayed green for travel.
It did, and I was there. I was lucky enough to be there myself. So you bought the lease and the lodge off Mr. Iceland himself, Arnie Baldursson.
Yep. In
2020 for the East Ranga, as you say, 2 weeks before the pandemic officially hit. And 2020 turned out to be the best year on record for salmon returns and catches.
I mean, we got extremely lucky. We had, because of my time in Iceland, lots of friends and people who are sort of keen to see what we were up to on East Ranga and things. And East Ranga, odd technical point, but the lodge at East Ranga, all of the guest rooms have their individual entrances from the outside. And so in terms of COVID practice, people could go to their own room without having to go through a corridor with rooms off of it. I mean, it's a silly detail, but actually we got quickly approved for sort of, okay practice for coming fishing because people could stay separated from each other. In fact, at one point we hired cars for the guests and they would follow the guide car to the river. And, when netting a fish, you sort of at handle's length. And then luckily everything calmed down and we got some, jabs and vaccines and various things, and everyone was able to be a bit more normal. But it was an odd year, but the river was full of fish.
One of the complaints, inevitably, that you will hear about Iceland, and people might be listening and go, it's all very well waxing on about fishing in Iceland, but it's incredibly prohibitive on cost.
Yeah.
What would you say to that?
I'd say it's a fair, a fair comment. I mean, but it's not just the fishing, a coffee, a bus ticket, everything is just incredibly expensive. It's unfortunately, the krona, after the financial crash in 2008, 9, 10, the krona went down and things became less expensive briefly, but it's been back up at sort of pre-crash levels in terms of costs, versus if you compare it to, our lifestyles and our costs here and our salmon fishing here is incredibly expensive, but it's also a pretty intense fishing trip. You go for, say, the classic is 3 days, which is actually 6 half-day sessions over 4 days. So you maybe fly out on the early BA flight to Iceland, get to the river, fish the afternoon, a full day in the morning, and head home on the afternoon flight on the 4th day. But in that period of time, you might fish 10, 12 hours a day. So you're fishing probably 30% longer, in each session than you would be anywhere else. And more to the point, you'll tend to be fishing over fish, new fish, taking fish. If you work your way to the edge of the Icelandic seasons, to what we'd call the shoulder, or even sort of slightly on the very edge of the shoulder season in Iceland, you'd find prices not that dissimilar to our own prices, back home, a couple of £300 a day for the fishing. But if you had a guide, hotel, etc., 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 it all stacks back up a little bit. But the fishing cost itself is much more reasonable at the outside edges, and you can still have very good fishing.
Those outside edges that you speak of, and obviously you're talking very early, almost pre-season, I'm guessing, and maybe beginning of June, all the way through into maybe mid-June, and then maybe September fishing, beginning of September. I know that there's some great deals to be had that I've seen, and there's some great fish to be caught. They might not necessarily be fresh fish in September, but that's never seemed to worry us when we go up to Scotland, for the sake of example. Yep. So I would urge people to check out the prices, that they might be pleasantly surprised. So you spent 25 years in this Atlantic salmon bastion that is Iceland, this stronghold. 2020 aside, what have you noticed about the returning fish and the numbers?
I think long-term trend is downwards. I think there's no questioning that. But there are kind of refreshing blips. You take 2024. I mean, rivers like Midfjordra and Nordre, they were 60, 70% up on their 23 catches and 22 catches. Grimsø, 50% up. Laxå and Alsum, probably 50, 60% up, maybe even more. Jokla, which is up above Egilsstadir in the east, up 50, 60, 70%, maybe even a bit more. And with quality fish, 2C winter and grilse. I mean, last year was an excellent grilse year for Iceland. And they predicted the year before that it would be, because there was, quite a nice sea temperature in June, July as the smolts went out. So they were hoping for pretty good survival rates. In fact, for this summer, the sea temperatures were slightly less favorable, but still on average, decent. So, that's how, we get word from the Freshwater Institute and the Saltwater Institute in Iceland, and they basically say, well, effectively putting their finger in the air, we expect, decent survival rates of juvenile fish going out to sea from last year. And we're hoping that because last year's growth run was decent, we'll have a half decent 2C winter fish run this year. And that was sort of across the board, was a decent growth run. Some rivers kind of held the line, but a lot of rivers were well above their catches from the year before. East Ranga is an interesting river in that it's effectively a manufactured salmon river, which is not a very complimentary way of describing a river I love very much, but that's an honest kind of description. It was Iceland's great sea trout river before the eruption of Hekla, which killed the river stone dead, just filled it with ash. But it's a river that flows from a very cold spring and has a little bit of glacial runoff, and then other sort of springs and creeks joining it on the way down. it's great in terms of, it never gets too warm. It runs 5 through 12 degrees water, so kind of perfect fishing temperatures. And that's why they started adding salmon smolts to it, thinking, you reverse psychology. You've got a river that has great fishing conditions. Let's add salmon rather than the other way around. And last year, we just had so much rain that the glaciers couldn't tolerate it. And gradually, eventually and we lost an awful lot of August. So, felt terribly sorry for the guys that came in August who probably lost 30 to 40% of their fishing, each slot of fishers. And you never, if you're not catching those fish when they're fresh, you probably never make up the numbers during the rest of the season.
Let me just catch up a little bit here. Because you had such heavy spates due to storms and rain.
Yeah.
What did that do to the returning fish?
It just coloured the river. And
just coloured the river.
Yeah, it kept shooting up, dropping down, imbalanced the fish basically. If it wasn't coloured, it was either rising or dropping very fast. And so we had this very unsettled August with storms coming. If a storm came from the east, it stopped over us. We're sort of central south. And if it came from the west, it stopped over us. So rather than getting half and half like the other areas of Iceland, we sort of seem to get everything.
A bit like the Pennines sounds like in England. So for the listener and for me, and I just think for clarity, so you've got the East Ranga and the West Ranga, and they both were killed stone dead by the eruption. When was that? 100 years ago?
1940s.
1940s, so 80 odd years ago. And some bright spark thought, well, they'll make fantastic angling rivers still because the conditions are perfect for salmon in every aspect of their life cycle apart from spawning. So we can recreate artificially that and create these rivers manufacture these rivers as you put yourself into angling rivers. And I've been lucky enough to fish the West Ranga, and I can vouch it's an incredibly exciting angling river, and I know that the East Ranga is too. Can you just explain to our listeners from beginning to end that journey of ranching a fish, if I can use that term, for angling purposes?
Yeah. So it's a bit chicken and egg because originally they used stock from, obviously had to introduce salmon stock from another river. But in terms of the hatchery process, it's very similar to, as it's done here in terms of, take some milt and eggs and mix them up generally late October, November time. The difference being that in the hatchery, you can retain temperatures at sort of 8, 10, 12 degrees once the fry develop. You can't actually turn the heat up too much while the egg is developing. Otherwise, you'll get a falsely rapid muscle growth or structural growth, which just isn't healthy for the fish. But in terms of natural spawning, you'll get a fish up to a smolt in perhaps 4 or 5 years, ready to head out to sea. That same process takes 17, 18 months in a hatchery where you can control temperatures, light, and food. Please believe me, I had no intention to become a hatchery rancher, basically farming smolts. It wasn't in my sort of wish list but it's a fascinating process, and it's taught me what I think can be done. I'm diverting slightly on our home rivers and on other rivers that have maybe had events or had just got below a level of sustainability. But anyway, sorry, back to the East Ranga.
But I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that's a really important point that you make. If I've understood that correctly, you've got a very unique situation with the Ranga rivers, and as much as they're effectively dead, depending on how you measure whether the river's alive or not, but because of the natural disaster or natural event
I speak for East Ranga particularly. At West Ranga, I wouldn't want to put words in.
Of course. But what you've got there is a very specific need if you want to make those rivers purely salmon angling rivers, and why not? If they're not producing much else, then you will ranch these fish in a very particular way with that in mind. And this isn't a one-size-fits-all conservation solution. No. This is very much an answer to an angling demand.
Correct. Yeah. I mean, I justify it to myself and not deliberately deceiving myself that, there's an awful lot of conservation measures we also need to keep people caring about salmon fishing. And, again, I'm slightly going off topic here, but we're not going to, I don't believe in your and my generation, we're similar ages. I don't think we're going to necessarily see salmon saved while we're alive, but we could see them go extinct if it goes badly the other way. Probably the next generation will be the ones that actually save it. And if they don't give a damn about salmon fishing, why would they bother? And so I think rivers like the East Ranga and potentially other rivers that perhaps are either effectively dead rivers or rivers that have gone beyond the sustainability. If we can use them to keep youngsters successful and having that feeling that I had when I caught my first salmon on the East Lynn, then we'll keep people interested in saving them.
I couldn't agree more with that ideology. I mean, it's certainly very important to keep anglers or to grow or to sustain the angling community. I think I'd go further and say that we need to actually have a massive seismic cultural shift as to our attitude as to what salmon are, what they represent, and why we're saving them, because it's got to be more than just fishermen. But I think certainly in Iceland, it's incredibly important because it's such a big part of their culture and industry. We digressed. That was my fault. So bring me back to that journey of a hatchery fish on the East Ranga.
Okay, so if we think of October, November, year one, fertilize the eggs, and you're effectively in an incubation room. That the ova eye in January, and they turn to effectively fry in February, March, and then you bring those fish forwards, and they'll get to skip all the way through year two. They're coming up to perhaps 3, 4, 5 grams in August, September of year two, and you're pushing them around. So you get to spring of year three, so May, June of year three, and those fish are 15 grams would be very small, ideally 22, 25 grams up to 35, 40 grams. And those fish will be of a smolting size. And you get them into cold water as they push through 10, 12, 14 grams, and they will effectively be ready to be put into what are ranching ponds, as we call them. Again, not a very complimentary term necessarily, but in creeks coming into the East Ranga, there are 9, 10, 12 ponds that have good water flow through them, clean, cold water, and those smolts will be put into those ponds in whatever proportion we feel is the correct proportion, and they'll continue to be fed and monitored in those ponds.
Are we talking hundreds or thousands?
We are. We're talking
thousands,
hundreds of thousands. Yeah,
hundreds of thousands.
Yep.
Wow. In each ranch pond?
Not each, but no. Overall,
right.
For East Ranga, we'd be looking to put in between 400,000 and 500,000 smolts a year, which is a big number.
Yeah.
And for West, it would probably be double that. Because if you think of returning percentages, once the smolts head out to sea, the returning percentages are very similar to any other salmon river. I mean, they face the same obstacles, the same search for food. We'd hope for 1% broad catch. So you send out 500,000 smolts, you'd hope for 5,000 fish.
Do you have a counter at the bottom of the East Ranga?
Not in the east, no. No, they've got a counter in one of the falls on the west. And some rivers have counters, very near the estuary, so you can literally you can tell exactly what's come in, sizes.
So of that 1% that you're getting to the rod from the 500,000 or so that you put out on the East Ranga, how many aren't being caught that are returning, do you think? I'm just trying to get a sense of numbers returning on a hatchery river, a complete hatchery river, compared to not.
You'd hope for maybe a 1.75% return and maybe catch 1% of that 1.75, as it were.
That's interesting, isn't it? So would you back the idea then of just sending more healthy smolt out to sea if you want to keep that number, sustain that number, or increase it? Or is it a bit more complicated than that?
I'd put it this way. I think if you have 300,000 excellent quality strong smolts that are really fighting fit and in fantastic condition, you'd probably have a similar return given the same other control conditions as 450,000 slightly less fantastic smolts. And so husbandry is absolutely key, and apart from anything else, because we're dealing with something I love that's alive, and husbandry to be as perfect as it can be.
I'm going to ask, it might be an ignorant question, bear with me. Obviously, we know about rogue fish. It's part of the evolutionary mastery of the Atlantic salmon. You're going to get rogue hatchery fish that aren't going to come up the East Ranga or the West Ranga. They're going to go up a non-hatchery river. What happens then? And how do those rivers feel about that?
The stock are from Icelandic rivers to start with. So
Right.
you could say there's a much more concentrated genetic, model because, 200 fish produce, 200 hens, would produce perhaps 1.5 million eggs that would end up in 500,000 smolts. So you could say it's a bit more condensed than a river that has a natural run of 2,000 fish and they will get released and they do their spawning, and it's a much more varied genetic pool. But generally speaking, it's Icelandic fish. Well, if you take, to the contrary of that, you've had those, big escape last year from a fish farm at Patreksfjörður, and they've caught nearly 500 salmon that escaped from there in 30 odd rivers in Iceland. Those are not native Icelandic fish. They're Norwegian genetics, and they're very, advanced, precise genetics for a purpose. And they had all sorts of, kind of comical, but actually not that comical images of guys in wetsuits with spear guns floating down the Midfjordur and the Blanda and other rivers, making sure that, the fantastic fish in the Midfjordur are what they should be. And they actually, amazingly, because it's so clear and the rivers are small, they did a fantastic job. So they've been pretty precise. I don't think they missed many fish. But it's those fish that escaped were caught in rivers from Finjoská, which is basically northeast of Hatchery, all the way around to Gelandsá, which is basically east of Vik in the southeast. A huge
swathe of coastline that those escapees managed to
unbelievable and
infiltrate.
West fjords, all over the shop.
It's heartening to hear that you're reasonably hopeful that those Norwegian spear gunners got most of them. Sadly, it's only going to take a few to cross-pollinate, isn't it? And that could really do some damage. So this is fascinating, or at least this is to me. So going back to that journey. So, okay, so they've gone out to sea.
Wind you back a sec. Sorry to interrupt. You've got those smolts in those ponds, which have creeks running into the river or flow from the river that's redirected through the pond into the river. They're fed for approximately, let's say they go into the ponds in late May. They're fed for, say, a month. They might go in early June, month and a bit. And at some point, they'll start feeding less and they'll start backing up and effectively looking for a way out of the river. And you'll see them silver. And we take samples and check on their progress, their smolting progress effectively. And when you feel the majority are ready, we open up the back of the ponds. And ideally, you pick a night that's very dark, cloudy, maybe some color in the water is ideal, because you want to give them the best chance of getting out, because you might not see a seagull or a predator or a cormorant or a merganser for a month. And the moment you open up that smolt pond, it is like people coming to watch, a premiere. It's from everywhere they come.
It's like Blackpool Pleasure Beach, full of gulls, and
unbelievable,
mergansers and cormorants and all sorts.
You only have to look over the sort of the flat areas. You know them by the rangas. You just see a cloud of white birds rolling down the river, and they're feasting. And that's part of the process. But in Iceland, unlike our home rivers, they have, what I think anyway, are more measured policies. They don't want to exterminate all the predators, but they want a balance, a reasonable balance kept. And so, there are less numbers of fish-eating birds and things like that, which I think does make a big difference. A really big difference.
So they're on their way. You're giving them the best possible chance for a start in life. The rivers muddy, dirty, coloured. It's cloudy, so they're going out stealth under cover of night. Off they go out into the big wide world to get big and fat and return as the adult fish that we love to try and catch. That's the last you see of these fish, and the rest of the time you're just sat there, I'm presuming, with your fingers crossed, going, let's hope as many come back as possibly they can. Do you get grilse and multi-sea winter returning?
Yep.
Can you control that, or is that just something that's in the lap of the gods?
Still guess. We for the brood stock that we take in the autumn, and we start collecting brood stock actually on the river any time from July throughout, and we have these big sort of stainless steel cages that are effectively in the river, submerged or almost submerged apart from the roof. And, when you catch a nice quality fish that looks like an excellent fish that you'd like to see more of, you put them in these large cages and they sit there shaded, in the cool water until they're picked up and taken to the hatchery. And we take a balance of grilse, 2C winter fish, and also fish from different stages in the season, because we don't know enough to know the timings of their returns and whether a 2C winter fish will only produce 2C winter fish. My suspicion is that it's a balance, and as you say, the rogue element applies within that as well. Yeah, hopefully we get a balance of sizes and fish that are prone to return in spring, summer, and autumn. All of that in Iceland obviously happens in 2.5 months.
So numbers wise, fascinating in the numbers. I think numbers are very important. We can always learn a lot about numbers, salmon through their numbers. You're catching, what's your average rod catch on the East Ranga? I know you said something like 9,000 in 2020, but what is it?
The average would be 4-ish.
So you catch 4,000 fish.
Yep.
Roughly speaking, how many of those make it to those cages and up onto the stripping?
So we'd look to have hopefully around 200 hens and perhaps 50, 60, 70 cockfish.
So they're the lucky ones that, well, lucky or unlucky, depending on how you look at it, I guess. But they go up there to be stripped and the scientists to do their magic. The rest of the fish, catch and release, catch and kill.
When we took it over, it was completely at the discretion of the fisher. There were no limits, no guidelines. And 2020, our first year, obviously was ludicrously productive. And I was a little bit shocked by it because I wasn't used to seeing the Torvi, the lovely guy from the smokehouse, visit that many times in a day to take fish away. And so we immediately said, look, that's just, we want to slightly change the perception of what's happening here. It's not just a river to come and catch a fish. It's a really beautiful river to fish, pretty quick water, lovely pools, great fly water. So we said, okay, well, you can catch whatever you want, but you can only take home some fish under 70 centimeters. We limited it to, I think, 4 fish per day, which sounds ludicrous, but 4 grilse per day, which we then wound back to 3, and you get, a fair bit of kickback, should we say, and we will eventually wind that back a little bit further as well. But, there are always, casualties here and there, people, bringing a fish back that swallowed a hook or something, a larger fish. We initially said, well, if that happens, it happens. And then, because people get overexcited, they want to take a big fish home and show their mate what they've caught. And we've all been there at different points in our life. We said, look, anything bigger than 70 centimeters that doesn't make it to being returned or to the hatchery, cages, you basically hand it into the kitchen and everyone can enjoy it there and then while they're staying.
So you release it. So it's the discretion of both yourselves, as in the organization, and the anglers as to what they can harvest. To what end? Because the fish that they release, they're not going to go on to spawn. You've decided which the spawning fish are because of the unique nature of the hatchery. What happens to those fish? Are you assuming that they're going to then go on to be given the opportunity to be caught again by rods upriver? And then what happens at the end of the season?
A bit of all of the above, effectively. Yeah, of course. Some fish are just naturally hugely aggressive, same as some humans, I guess. But over the course of the time since the volcano, the river has gradually been cleaning out back to its gravel base. And so we've seen, probably in the last 2 years, we've seen a lot more juvenile fish that we can't explain. And there is a tributary called the Fiscal, which comes into the bottom of Beat 9, which is a natural spawning tributary, but mainly for sea trout rather than salmon. But it's been quite an odd process. We've been noticing, especially some of the the really experienced guides that have been there for decades. They sort of I was down on Beat 4 and in the shallows and noticed there were a lot of juvenile fish around. Now, some of those could be char. There is a natural spawning head of char that somehow, kept kicking. But something just in me wants to see if, gradually we see more juveniles and, wind back the program a little bit and let's see if the river can kick on a bit by itself. I don't think it will ever be an exclusively wild river. But there are areas of it now which are really cleaning up and looking decent.
That's interesting, isn't it? That would be a very unique situation if a river that was completely destitute with regards to spawning ground habitat due to the volcano, then as nature starts to repair itself, you borrowed that river as a hatchery river for anglers, and then in doing so, you've reintroduced the salmon stock that then become wild again. That's taking the term rewilding to the extreme, don't you think?
I mean, the real question with that would be, it was Iceland's most famous sea trout river. Should we really be sea trout, not salmon? And that's a sort of another question for another time.
That is, and perhaps for another podcast. That's fascinating. That really is fascinating. And just to finish off that journey, because I know certainly on the West Ranga, at the very end of the season, the locals are encouraged to come and, for want of a better expression, clear out what's left, and they do a pretty good job of it. And I'm told that's because I'm talking about clearing out, as in the fish, by whatever means, to then take home and for the table. Is that, I assume, healthy for a salmon hatchery, angling salmon hatchery river to clear the way for the next generation? I'm guessing you don't want kelp, floating around.
We definitely catch fish. I mean, the salmon will follow their instincts and they will spawn. But it's the fact that their fertilized eggs, are almost exclusively die. The conditions are so cold. There's very little food for the juveniles, and with all the volcanic ash, as was less now, but still a lot, constantly rolling. It's suffocating the eggs or moving them or kicking them up for char to eat or anything else to eat. We see a decent number of fish that have clearly come up, not been caught or been caught and released, that have had their crack at spawning, however unsuccessfully, have headed out, and they come back second year as a fish that's on its next crack. Just like in any other salmon river, if a fish is lucky enough to get back to sea or having spawned. And again, I think that is absolutely fine. Why not? Your question about the locals coming in late. They love late season fishing. A lot of my and our clients, in the domestic Icelandic market, and they love to have a smoked salmon for Christmas. And it's probably one of the few rivers that can tolerate that, along with West Ranga and a couple of others.
I think it's certainly very culturally very fitting and inclusive to be able to give people, perhaps who can't afford to pay the prices, the locals, if you like, to fly fish for these fish during the season, a chance to go and catch a fish for the table.
I mean, I've been very welcome in Iceland since minute one. Some of my great mates that I first guided with now run the famous rivers around Iceland, who take Gisli Ásgeirsson, who taught me a lot about Icelandic fishing, who's now running, Seller and Hofsö and the Six Rivers project for Jim Ratcliffe. And, I've been lucky to have great support and nobody having a crack at me. I know a fair few people find Jim's ownership now of a big chunk of Iceland pretty contentious, but a lot of what he's doing is actually really interesting, I think.
Yeah.
Doing some reforesting and doing, a lot of very helpful work for salmon and Seller. It's in a remote enough area of Iceland that he can really, do a lot of those projects and quantify their benefits.
It's interesting you should say that, because we would love to have somebody involved in the Six Rivers project on the show. It's obviously very in keeping with what we're interested in on this podcast. But you're right that when it's mentioned, it's a polarized answer we normally get. I think normally it's around sharing is what we're hearing, and it would be helpful to, because obviously he's leaps and bounds ahead with regards to the resources that he can tap into there and the unique landscape that he's got his hands on. So the jury's out for us. We'll wait and see. We'll see if we can talk to him. But as far as you're concerned, what they're doing there is great. Is fantastic for the salmon.
I think a lot of the stuff they're doing there is really interesting, and improving the spawning options for the salmon there. Expanding. I mean, Seller used to be a short run up to the main Foss waterfall, and that was it. Salmon couldn't get above there. They built the ladder in '60s. Now the salmon go another 45 kilometers up in big numbers. So, I mean, it's a very quantifiable improvement in the numbers of fish and the distance they travel and the sheer acreage that they populate. And then made a ladder in Efrifjord, the top waterfall, and now the salmon push up into basically what is kind of almost Icelandic tundra. And they're growing numbers in a very remote place, and they're reforesting a lot of these tributary areas as well, and seeing what that brings, whether it's insect life or shelter or protection. It's just interesting because, like you say, they've got resources, and as much as I'm an Arsenal fan, and maybe that we wouldn't necessarily compliment each other in that respect, I think what they're doing on the river is fascinating.
It's good news. Well, great. Well, we can't wait to hopefully have a conversation with someone involved down the line there. And just while we're on that part of Iceland, we've been hearing well, not so recent actually, the ongoing battle with the wonderful people of Seyðisfjord. For those of you who don't know, sounds like a very authentic, almost bohemian-leaning Icelandic community on the east coast there, minding their own business, going about their day-to-day around what is apparently a beautifully pristine Icelandic fjord. And one of the big fish farm dynastic companies has bought it, or has bought the lease on it, and I think they've got permission in putting some farms in there, and the whole town, the whole community have united, haven't they? And basically are doing wonderful, peaceful protests to stop what they believe will be the ruination of their community because of these fish farms.
Yeah, and I think they're probably not far wrong. Money talks in these things, and it has done for time immemorial. But now people are, maybe saying, well, actually, there's something slightly more important. And the fact is, the money doesn't flow into those people anyway. It's some really obvious stuff of, selling it in as lots of employment and lots of business and things, and it just doesn't materialize because it's an ever more mechanized, low employment business that's prepared to take massive losses of dead fish because it's commodity. It's not philosophy, and so it just doesn't bring any benefits at all. Iceland is pretty unique in that I reckon that Iceland can probably move to an entirely land-based salmon farming process. And they've got, you've got several different Icelandic companies basically throwing themselves into it 150%. You've got Geo Salmon, you've got what used to be Landeldi, which is now called First Water. They've produced their first 1,500 tons of fish. They've just secured another 80 million euros of funding from Arion Bank and another Icelandic bank, Landsbanken. I mean, they're pushing ahead, and they're going to produce a lot of salmon. I mean, I think partly the problem is also somewhere in the last couple of decades, salmon went from being a treat and something you really look forward to being what you expect, every lunch, kind of in your break in the morning even perhaps, and you throw away half of it because you're not really that hungry. It's become kind of a really low expectation food, maybe a bit more, that's maybe a bit cruel, but it's not seen as a sort of a now and again treat anymore. And I think it's hard to wind that back. So we need to find a way to allow people to have salmon in a way that doesn't damage the estuaries. And I think land-based salmon farming, it's going to produce a slightly more expensive fish. But I think Iceland will probably be the first country to somehow get rid of all of its coastal salmon farming in exchange for that, because I think it's politically and financially more advantageous for the Icelanders to do that.
Obviously, aquaculture is a conversation that is incredibly topical, prevalent, and contentious. But you said something interesting just then, and you spoke about we need to potentially change our attitude towards how we eat this fish and why. And that's a cultural shift, isn't it? Correct me if I'm mistaken. Tell me a little bit more about that. What do you mean by that?
I think salmon has become a low expectation, low respect food. I'm not sure perhaps it's the technology of producing that many tons of salmon. Maybe it is literally the simplest, cheapest protein, but I'm sure, the quality of the farm salmon is probably, no higher or more nutritious than low
bag of crisps
or else. Yeah. So, I think it's become a cultural shift, which I can't see being able to row back on very easily, because to retrain people to sort of push it up their radar is going to be very difficult. But it's a sad shift, because I think certain foods, especially that are derived from animals or fish that have such a struggle, should be respected.
I couldn't agree more, and I think perhaps I might, if I dare, go one further and say, as and when stem cell culture and growing our own proteins becomes affordable and widespread, which in my personal opinion is the future, it'll be very interesting to see what happens with salmon farming then. Now, you're British. A lot of anglers, and I say anglers, I can't speak for people beyond the angling community, are now asking for serious consideration to implement similar structures, hatchery structures, if you will, ranch fish in UK rivers, potentially on some big, iconic Scottish salmon rivers. We've spoken to various people in season 1 about this. Ken Whelan, I think, from memory, certainly was very clear and very articulate about it. He thinks that there is a case to perhaps single out certain rivers as completely angling rivers. If you want that river to be somewhere where people will spend money to go and catch a salmon, and the wild stock is beyond sustainable, then maybe there's an argument to make it a hatchery river like the river that you run over there in Iceland. But there's certainly, that distinction needs to be made, because you need to have if we're talking about a wild salmon stock that is in dire straits and in a steep decline, you want to be having a conservation river and you want to be having an angling river. Can you have the same river do both things? There's a big discrepancy. There's a big argument and debate around that. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, I think you can.
You can.
I think so. You've got some major projects going on at the moment, as you know only too well. I mean, you've got that Laxford project, which is potentially a really magic exploration of what can be done when you have control from formative tributaries right to the ocean and the estuaries. But that isn't your normal river. Your normal river is owned by dozens and dozens and dozens of people, all 20% of which will agree on something and 100% of which won't agree on everything. And that's part of the problem. But in Iceland, it's a small country with less than 400,000 people, and it can move quickly. It can make decisions quickly. It has a legal obligation of anyone who owns land abutting a salmon river to effectively join an association, that association to elect a board, the board to decide what happens with the river. They can fish it themselves. They can rent it to somebody else. They can employ, someone to sell it on their behalf. But effectively, there's a decision made for the entire river system, including any tributaries where smolts, live or anywhere where salmon can access, basically. And we don't have that same sort of community coming together on a river and making a decision for the river in the same way as you do in Iceland. That's one obstacle I see. But if you took, I don't know, the great river that I was tortured having to sit on the bank and watch my dad fish as a kid, and all I wanted to do was have one go. I mean, that river has probably quite individual strains of fish in the various different tributaries and the Fuch and wherever else. But there's absolutely no issue with a hatchery that runs 2, 3, 4 completely separate genetic lines that will take broodstock from the tributaries, and they'll go down that line and you'll produce smolts for that go back into that tributary. I don't feel like you're damaging, the authenticity of the river. Maybe a tributary has a particular flood event that really wipes out, a lot of stock. I think you can use this flexible approach and assist rivers stay authentic to their genetics, but also be a great fishing river. I don't see it as one or the other. The Laxford, again, I see it as a fascinating, amazing project, but a very different project to what is achievable in most cases.
Perhaps add some context to that. The Laxford, for those who don't know, is in the northwest of Scotland, zoned wholly by the Duke of Westminster, is that correct? Who's very, very kindly lent the river to the Atlantic Salmon Trust to run one of their core rivers project, which is being headed up by the brilliant Chris Conroy, who we hope to have on as a conservation, pure wild salmon conservation. We're very lucky, I think, to have that opportunity from the Duke. Is there a particular secret, Peter? You've run this hatchery river, this successful hatchery river. Is there anything that you can share, any tips, any secrets that you might want to give any of these fisheries, these rivers up in Scotland, for the sake of example, who are thinking about trying to persuade SEPA or the EA or whoever it is to really go full guns as a hatchery river? What could you share with them that they might not already know?
All I'd say is have the confidence to push for it, because I really believe that some rivers will go over the critical yard arm effectively sooner than later, and it will work. You won't lose your river that you love so much. You won't damage its authenticity. You won't create some adjustment in the genetics that you'll never be able to recover from. Good husbandry, like good farming, you can produce excellent conditions for the wild genetics to give them a leg up effectively. East Ranga, we put a lot of smolts in places. I think you can assist a river in an effective way without completely flooding with smolt.
It's funny, isn't it? And I hear what you're saying, but we're then, of course, absolutely jumping feet first into aquaculture. We become the farmers of salmon just as much as those that we vilify.
Absolutely.
Right now, perhaps for better reasons, should I say.
Last thing I'd say on that is the general practice to release fry or par. From my perspective, every time I would say, bring your juveniles to smolt. A, because they're not competing with the wild fry and par for quality feeding or space or cover. And B, because I think if you do that, those fish spend minimal time in the river. They're straight out to sea, spend a month perhaps in a pond on a creek that comes into the river. But you can basically take natural genetics without competing with what might be scarce resource for the wild fish. And they'll head out to sea and hopefully come back and keep things rolling on the river.
That's interesting you should say that again. I mean, I've spoken to other small hatchery projects, smaller than yours, who would argue the polar opposite and say you need to be putting them in as eggs because that is that way the genetics are least tampered with. So I guess it just depends what the goal is, and depending on what that goal is how you do it. And there are many different strings you can pull now within salmon husbandry.
Yep.
Fascinating. Thank you, Peter. That really is always fascinating to talk to somebody who knows what they're talking about when it comes to hatcheries, because there are so many out there that have opinions and very few that actually have the experience or the knowledge to back them up. We end our show with 3 questions. You're an angler, which is great. That makes it easier. We'll get to that in a minute. First question is, if you had €1 billion, an insurmountable amount of funds, how would you spend it if you had to spend it on saving the wild salmon?
God, I mean, it is if only, it'd be brilliant, wouldn't it? I think first of all, we've got to get a like the famous seed vault in Svalbard. We need a vault of, while we've still got salmon in enough rivers, we need a genetic vault for all of these rivers and all of the tributaries, so that if we don't win in the short term, we might be able to reintroduce in the longer term. And that's an expensive project, and it'd be a wonderful project. But I think that would give us a backstop, which is not necessarily, where we want to get to, but just in case. This world's pretty volatile at the moment, I'd suggest.
So you'd harvest DNA, harvest the gene.
Yeah, or freeze fertilized eggs. 5,000-10,000 eggs from each river, which actually sounds a lot, but it's one hen, and perhaps you go a little bit more varied than that, but you get, as I say, in something like the D or the Spey, you don't just do for the river, you do for the tributaries, the areas upper, lower, autumn fish, spring fish. And I think you could have a fantastic security blanket with that, which would be relatively expensive, but might not take up your €1 billion.
I like the idea of having a Fort Knox, a salmon vault somewhere that holds all these frozen eggs and this DNA. Wouldn't that be something?
It would be a great backstop. Not where we want to get to necessarily, but it would provide the ability to repopulate a river with its original genetics should the worst happen for that river. Secondarily, I think I would, I've got a 6-year-old daughter. She loves salmon fishing. She has an unnaturally high liking for smoked salmon as well, which is good. I think is a good thing. So, I want her to be able to catch salmon going forwards. I would probably spend quite a lot of money taking on some good rivers and good beats and basically make it almost exclusively for youngsters. Or at least every other slot would be for under 18s or under 12s and I've got some wonderful friends, from Ian Kirk to, Gordon Armstrong to Chris Haig, guys who teach them and enthuse them, get them using kit, get them understanding why they're doing it and why it's important. They'll carry the fight forward. But we need to get successful. They need to catch a fish.
I think I couldn't agree more. You're speaking my language. We need to encourage and make it easily accessible. Not just angling. I would again go further and say we should be investing heavily into interesting, incentivized educational institutions that invite the youngsters to come on board and look at our rivers and look at the salmon and look at the whole habitat and everything that hangs off the back of the wild salmon. Because without that, I'm really worried about what happens once we're out of the way. So that's a great use of money. Thank you, Peter. That's a fantastic use. You want a salmon vault and you want to give free salmon angling to youngsters. Brilliant.
And tuition.
Fantastic. Okay, back to the real world. You've got no money, not necessarily you personally, hypothetically for the question. Well, what can you do to help save the wild salmon?
Just I'll probably sit in a corner and cry because I don't feel like it'd be useful.
You can't be that defeatist. We cannot accept that as an answer. That we're trying to instill hope on this show.
I would certainly join those protests in Seyðisfjörður. I would certainly join those protests outside the Parliament in Reykjavik. And I'd encourage everyone that, there are so many reserved people in this country who don't feel that showing up to a march or a protest or signing up to a petition is important. But it is important. And it doesn't cost anything. And maybe it costs a train ticket or something like that. But, it's talking about big money invested. You have to do what you can, basically.
Every voice counts, doesn't it? Every signature counts. I couldn't agree more. I think everybody who feels in any way passionate about this fish can do something. Even if it is as little as signing a petition or going to a petition, it makes a huge difference. Your voice is important. So thank you. That's a great answer. Finally, it's your last day on Earth. You've got to spend it fishing. I'd imagine you wouldn't be forced into doing that. Where would you go and who with?
I'd have to go back to Vellacott's pool on the East Lynn in July with my brother and my father.
That's in Devon, right?
That's in Devon, yeah, north coast of Devon. And it's a place where there's 2 pools very close to each other, one called Overflow and one called Vellacott's. And I'd snuck away age 10, walked about a mile downstream from where we were staying, hooked a fish in Overflow, and this really nice guy, it was like 9-10 pound fish, big fish for there. And I've never felt that feeling since, that takes your breath away in thinking about it. And the really nice chap tried to help me land it, and he had a tailer, and he slipped it onto the fish and slipped it forwards as he closed it, and it cut the line. And I literally burst into tears. And I can remember just like this desolation. And I started to trudge home, which was going past Vellacott's. And I was on a worm, which was, whatever, as I was. Got to Vellacott's, and the only thing I had was a number 3 copper meb. And I just flicked it up into the fish pass. So, a bit late to arrest me for that. But I was standing well below the fish pass, and first cast hooked a 4-pound grouse, which I landed, whacked on the head, and I walked all the way up the steep bank through these trees to the road so I could carry it up the road, showing everyone who drove past. Got home, Dad was impossibly proud of me, and that was the beginning of it.
Good for you. Wow. That must have been heartbreaking, that initial loss.
Oh my God.
Under someone else's
quantifying
responsibility.
It's impossible.
I would need therapy. I would definitely need therapy. That was really interesting. That was really fascinating. Thank you so much, Peter Rippin.
My pleasure.
And on the next episode of The Last Salmon, Frederick Mowinckel, the self-described eco-industrialist whose family were one of the original salmon farm owners in Norway, talks about crossing the Rubicon on his crusade against salmon farming.
Big shareholders decided to take the company in a direction that we didn't want to be part of. Money became far more important than supporting the local farmers. Money became more important than looking after the environment, and we decided to leave the company completely.
And why his opposition to the world's biggest salmon farming corporation, Maui, or Mowi as is correctly pronounced, is deeply personal.
I am telling the world about the damage being caused. If people still want to be salmon farmers, if people still want to invest in salmon shares, if they still want to eat salmon, that's up to them. But they can never tell me that they didn't know.
Listen and follow The Last Salmon on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember to keep in the fight for our salmon. The Last Salmon Season 2 is supported by the Missing Salmon Alliance.